Well, welcome everybody. It's a great honor and delight to have Professor Ram-Prasad addressing us here for the Stanton lectures. And it's particularly exciting that he will be speaking about Abhinava Gupta and Spinoza today. So I think we will be heading into monist territory.
Yes, we are heading. An accurate forecast, we're indeed heading into monist territory. So what I suggested in juxtaposing Shankara and Zhuangzi last time was that they shared common sense of estrangement from the world as it is normally encountered. And so their inclination towards oneness was to try and resolve this sense of tension between oneself and the world of plurality one found oneself in. And of course, then we saw that the diagnosis of that condition, although in both cases involving a certain kind of misunderstanding of, well, the accusation that people normally misunderstand how reality is, nevertheless led them to quite opposed responses, both in what they thought required doing and what we should do to go about overcoming this misleading world of manyness. Today and on Monday, I'm going to do another pair, Gupta and Spinoza, where I'm going to read the way of oneness here in perhaps a more straightforward manner to suggest that both of them have a common program, similar program, which broadly these days we call monism. So what I mean here is the idea that I'm going to suggest oneness as in both their cases being about a commitment to the view that there is only one constituent stuff to all reality. Not there is one thing that is reality, although whether that is the case or not, I think it's up for grabs. I'm not going to have time to go deeper into it. At the very least, there is the commitment for both of them is that the apparent diversity of the world is actually to be understood by a principle of oneness. Now, this is not a denial of the plurality of the things that are found in this world. It's neither, at least they don't intend to say, that the world we find, which seems to have so many different things in it, is illusory or in some sense not as these things are. At least that's what they intend. Nor do they mean to say that a particular kind of analysis would assimilate the ontology of these objects into merely or only our cognition of them. They mean to preserve, as things go, the plurality of this world. And by this plurality, both of them detect two major features. One is the plurality of sentience, reflexive consciousness, the awareness that there are these things, whether they're one or many, which also appear to be plural in locus, that there are many such points of sentience. And then on the other hand, there is also the plurality of the objects of consciousness, which, at least in the structure of experience, present as insentient. That is to say, this duster is an object of my awareness of it in a way in which I am not the object of the duster, whereas I might be an object of your consciousness being. And therefore, in terms of the world, we have the starting point of a plurality of subjects and plurality of objects. And both Abhinava and Spinoza seek to say that in the end, there is actually only one stuff for all of this reality, to which they are willing to give the name God. So what I'll try and do today is sketch out how Abhinavagupta tries to present this, and he has a vast rubric, and he has a very elaborate practical theology, which takes as its founding commitments a conception of God as this constituent male and female, Shiva and Devi. It has a set of practices of physical and mental rigor, which seek to transform what we take ourselves to be through transgressive social practices. It includes commitment to particular such practices which carry as objects of consciousness, of contemplative consciousness, these goddesses, behind which again there is an elaborate theology, and also pushing to the extreme for advanced practitioners, transgressive practices and esoteric rituals, which are only to be carried out by very advanced practitioners, which is supposed to transform those who are prepared into a sort of a re-envisaging of themselves. So it is within a very, very dense and multidimensional cultural and practical theology that Abhinava operates. All of this is said to be founded on a particular type of account or theory of consciousness, the pratyabhijna, which literally translates as recognition. And the idea is that at all points, the definition of consciousness consists in its reflexivity, and that this reflexivity is a constant recognition of its own content and its own dynamism. In this way, it sharply distinguishes itself from Advaitic theories of consciousness, where there is no dynamism. All that is dynamic, all that is changeful in the content of consciousness for Advaita, people like Shankara, are actually transient states of mental apparatus, which is not itself consciousness. Consciousness in the Advaitic model is purely a particular presence that we saw is termed Brahman. Whereas for Abhinava and his school, consciousness is contentful, it's dynamic, it's reflexive. And as we will see, it plays a different role in the constitution of the world. So what does Abhinava mean when he talks about this consciousness? As I've already been saying about Shankara, and will again even more so for the thinkers to come, I'm picking a very, very particular way in the time I have through the vast oeuvre of Abhinava. From on with Abhinava, with Spinoza, with Ramanuja, and with Ibn Arabi, we have a lot of stuff attributed to them, that's written directly by them. And so I couldn't even begin to claim that what I'm saying is in any way systematically representative or a systematic exegesis of their position. In Abhinava's case, I'm going to, in fact, pick through particular passages in one of his shorter works called the Tantra Sara, the River of Tantra, and with one or two other passages, because I want to just pick out a particular, what I take to be characteristic aspect of his overall position and how that has a bearing on oneness. So for him, there is an identification between what you translate normally as consciousness, in this case Samvid, and God. And that this principle is the one explanatory constituent stuff of all there is. So intrinsic being, that is to say, being from which all definition of other beings starts, svabhava, is what is ultimately to be attained. So where you are now is a misunderstanding if you think you are intrinsically you as the person of particular birth and particular form and particular psychophysical history and a particular track through this world. You're wrong. That is not what is ultimately you. What is ultimately you is, in fact, this intrinsic being. This intrinsic being of all entities is of the nature of light. So light is the most powerful metaphor for consciousness for Abhinava. Since what is not light cannot be intrinsic being. What he means by that, and he has a lot more to say in other places, is that light is the starting point. It is consciousness that is intrinsic, because all other things, to even assert and deny them, is dependent on your consciousness of them. So the one thing that is inescapable in any statement you make, to even say that consciousness is actually no different from the thing that makes up the stable, is already to be committed to the intrinsic nature of consciousness and not of all the things with which you wish to identify it or to reduce it to. So you cannot actually embark on any kind of a program without starting from consciousness, and that is intrinsic. And whatever you say about the world and reality, if you were going to say the world is made up as by things that are no different from dusters and speakers, even to make that claim, you're already talking about things which are dependent already and always on consciousness. But he has a further claim to make, because it's not just that he's saying you cannot embark on a program, say, of any kind of what we would now call physicalism. He was, in fact, engaging with sort of opponents of that time. It's not just that. Furthermore, there is nothing other than light. That is the move to what we would now call monism. No other intrinsic being can be within that light, because there is no duality in its intrinsic being. So there is not one thing which is at one and the same time light and not light. So once you're committed to the intrinsic starting point of consciousness of light, there is no other principle, because whatever you're talking about them in, as it were, light of the light. Time and space cannot cause is division, because they too have light as their intrinsic being. Light is only one, and it is consciousness. Consciousness is of the nature of lighting objects. He says all agree on this. But actually just think about it, and this is always, of course, a move that is made by most revisionary metaphysicians. They're going to say, on the one hand, this is a really hard thing to get to because it goes against everything you normally assume and you're fundamentally wrong about what you understand the world to be. On the other hand, just think a little bit about it. Just think, and you'll see how wrong all these people who assert plurality are. They says, all agree on this. Can you start elsewhere than from consciousness? Is there anything that can be asserted that isn't, in fact, consciousness? Everything else that is asserted in the light of consciousness. Therefore, every explanation being dependent on consciousness, anything that is within that light is part of it. But that's the radical, so almost jump he makes, as others have done. So this world in which consciousness, light, God are all identical, the world which contains myriads of subjects and manifold objects of experience, none of whose ontological separateness he denies, is what he calls the self-expansion of God, for him normally called Shiva, Shiva Devi. Shiva is, as it were, the supreme universal in the form of the supreme light. So the oneness is that light which is consciousness, which is God. But that light in which the world exists has this kind of pluralist content. It's given by what he calls the many ontological categories. So again, he has no problems with saying there are such things as objects, there are such things as numbers, there are such things as individual thoughts, there are such things as time and space. But God, consciousness, light, contains such ontological categories as, for example, the material, which has hardness, heaviness, grossness, and so on. So all the things that you think of as constituting materiality is there, but actually its toughness, what makes it what it is consciousness. So this is where, and we have found that sometimes with contemporary accounts of what is now called panpsychism, it is not so much a contrast to saying there are objects, but objects are really only consciousness. What Abhinava is trying to say is, no, we're not saying that there aren't these objects, that they don't have particular kinds of ontological distinctness, hardness and heaviness and grossness. It's not that they are really to be reworked as, say, secondary qualities or hallucinatory properties of our own mental activity. No, no, no. They are things, but the stuff of which things are made is consciousness. There in the light, all these modes of existence, things which are stable and dynamic, fire and water and stone and so forth, they all shine, defined by their own boundedness. We can make out their plurality. They expand into various aspects by virtue of, however, they expand by the virtue of the free, independent, that is to say, non-dependent, the independent light, the light that isn't dependent on anything else, as we saw. Another version of that view, the totality of causes, that is to say, what we take to be the world as it's constituted through its causal interactions in the world, you know, the relationship between it, this being hard and this being hard, and putting a hard thing fast on a hard quickly on a another hard surface causes a noise. All those kind of causal connections. The totality of causes is the weaving together of the entirety of existence by the majesty of the awareness, the aware independent consciousness of God. Thus, such a totality at the time of the production of the nature of things, one by one, is the intrinsic being of the multitude of existence conditioned by their respective time and space. as and when the differentiation of being amongst the totality gains something additional. You make new things, a tree grows or a star is formed, the greater the increase in distinctions in type of effect to different degrees. So in other words, everything that you take this world to be, all the generativity of objects is fine. It's not a problem. There's nothing that is being denied here, nothing that is being made, rendered illusory at some ultimate level. It is just that that entirety is in fact made up of this consciousness. So you dig down and you might get to finer and finer levels, what in Sanskrit you call anu, atoms, by which are meant sort of the ultimate physical entities which constitute things. You're not going to get further than that. You can divide all of these things, the totality of things that are generated and exist in particular spatio-temporal organizations. But what they are actually made up of, not just their constituents to the ultimate level of analysis, but what makes them at all be is consciousness. So that is the world for Abhinav. So that is a strong monist statement, a monism that does not deny the reality of objects, but says that the constituency of object is given by consciousness. Then what about the subjects? Because subjects seem to be as plural as objects. So if you are going to say that the way in which you, without denying the reality of plural objects, you nevertheless bring them within the monistic principle of consciousness to say that one constituent of all of them is actually consciousness. What about the many bits of consciousness that represent the plurality of subjects we encounter in the world? The supreme God, whose intrinsic being is knowing, independent consciousness, I think actually here it should be more awareness, reflexive independent consciousness, is the body of the world, as well as the creator of individual objects, such as the pot. This is because the consciousness of the potter, the one who makes that object, is not something additional to the one consciousness. It is one with the consciousness of God, with the body of the potter being cast among the multitude of existence. So you have here a subject, the potter, and an object, the pot that is being made. Are there not here at least two entities which are not God? No, it's not so. The object, just like the whole world, is simply, as he calls metaphorically, the body of God. So that is just the totality of objects, including all additionalities, being made up of consciousness, as we saw. But so too is the apparent creator of individual objects such as a pot, which come into the world as yet another entity. The one who is doing this is not another consciousness. So just as the pot coming into existence is not something beyond what is already explained, which is to say the world that is the body of God, the potter making it is not a consciousness other than the consciousness of God. Question: how then does the potter have the self-conceit, the sense that his body is the agent and his body is the mode of agency, as it were? The answer: this, as much as the pot itself, is made by the Supreme God. On this account, our account, the doctrine of the totality of causes confirms the agency of the reflexively aware consciousness, whose body is the universe. So actually, there is still only one principle. So in this apparent relationship between two things, the object and the subject, the pot and the potter, who prima facie seem to be other than God, it turns out they're not. They are, in fact, different modes of the same one supreme God, who's the intrinsic being of all the things, potter and the pot included, including the self-conceit, the misunderstanding, the sense of being separate that the potter has. The potter has the sense, I am making the spot. God is not making the spot. This is, of course, that state of taking oneself to be the one who's making the pot is itself, of course, part of consciousness. So particular states and particular modes of individuation are themselves not different from the reflexively aware consciousness. So we don't have a problem in recognizing these forms of conceit that generate subjective plurality. Of course, they are there, just as there are forms, there are modes of objects that have their own plurality. So we should make a distinction here, Abhinava is basically saying, between the kind of phenomenal presence of plurality, whether of subjects and objects, and the explanatory principle that they are all the one consciousness. But of course, he has to admit that this doesn't seem that way. Even if you really think hard about it, you'll find that the explanation is that there is only one consciousness that explains everything. The fact is that what we find in the world is not such self-awareness. So he has to grant and provide within his account how it is, what's the structure of this sense of plurality. The potter who doesn't feel God is making the pot. In this, our system, this right cognition is a cause of liberation. That is to say, liberation from the sense of being trapped in plurality, because of its contradiction of non-cognition, which is instrumental to bondage. So what we have in the world is a non-cognition of the oneness of consciousness. And understanding that it's wrong to think that there is a plurality of consciousness is the way to escape those bonds. The non-cognition that we normally have, it's twofold. One abides in the intellect, or the other pertains to the self. I'm not being clear exactly what the status of that distinction is, but he explains it in this way. That which abides in the intellect is a fundamental absence of certitude, and indeed a contradictory certainty about selfhood. So as we think about the world, as we try and explain it, the more we explain the world, the more it seems to him that people generate accounts which trap them in plurality. And that plurality includes a sense of selfhood. Who I am turns on a whole set of what I take to be objective facts, or facts about objects. My body, my mind, my origins, the way I track in the spatial temporality of life, all of those things give me a sense that I have this individual self, and that selfhood requires this plurality of objects. Non-cognition of the self is a contracted and scattered construal of selfhood, constituted by thought constructs, and that is the root cause of miserable life cycles. So not only is it that plurality generates this miscognition about the world, generates a sense of myself as embedded in a plural world of objects. Since everyone is doing it, and my doing it divorces me, cuts me off, makes me feel separate and different from somebody else who would have a different body, a different track through life, a different set of memories, a different set of mental activity, any sense of constructing myself in a plural world is also to scatter the sense of consciousness. Think there is this account here, there's that account there, there's another account here. All of that is a misunderstanding of the oneness of consciousness. But there is only one whole reality that is just consciousness, undivided by time, unsplit by space, unaffected by contingent attributes, unrestricted by form, not indicated by words, and not manifested through the instruments of knowledge. That is to say, the normal kind of, well, I know there's a microphone in front of me because I can see it, kind of knowledge claim. It is the cause of the attainment of one's intrinsic being, this consciousness. It is the reality which is the independent condensed bliss. A very favorite phrase of this, condensed bliss, meaning it's not scattered. The I. The world is reflected inside, within me. The one who firmly and always discerns this in absorption in the Supreme God is not dependent on any means. So what Abhinava suggests, as of course most of the classical Indian thinkers do, is upon the proper diagnosis of why reality isn't what we take the world to be, what are you going to do about it? It's not simply to come to an analytic conclusion that if you think about it systematically, objects in fact are dependent upon consciousness, and therefore the one principle on which all ontology should be built is consciousness, is not simply an intellectual conclusion. It's not just an argument to be arrived at against, say, a Nyaya realist who wants a pluralist who has a different view of the world. It's not just that. That miscognition is an existential blemish on the consciousness undertaking. So it's not just, you're not doing the analysis for itself, for its own sake. There is a transformative telos. You go from being persuaded through Abhinava's teaching that there is only consciousness, that all the spatiotemporal division by which there is plurality in this world is actually not what consciousness is. That's all features, but they are all based in, made up of this one stuff that is consciousness, that is obviously not indexed by time and space and particularity. It's not just enough to come to that conclusion. It is that it becomes the cause of the attainment, or more to the point, the re-attainment in consciousness of its continuity with that consciousness. The sense that the world is reflected inside, within me. The one who firmly and always discerns this absorption in the Supreme God is not dependent on means. You're always dependent on means when you function in this world as a world of plural objects and plural subjects. But once that consciousness within is absorbed in the godly supremacy that it is continuous with, then it is transformed, and it is free. It is no longer dependent. Now, there's a whole other question to be asked about, exactly as we asked about Shankara. Well, is that a phenomenological description of that? Is that consistent? How does that get reflected in a person who has reached that state? All of those questions are there, of course. Here I'm just pointing out that for Abhinava, as with most of these revisionary sort of Hindu and Buddhist thinkers, to have a persuasive view of the world, and more than, say, Shankara, Abhinava trusts in an argument rather than simply in, or rather than relying ultimately on textual testimony. Abhinava spends quite a good deal of time trying to argue his way to the plausibility of this position. Then saying that if your acceptance of that position has followed the right path, then it becomes the cause for the transformation of the consciousness in you. That is that absorption or reabsorption in God. So monism is not just a commitment to a persuasive view. Monism is the reattainment of consciousness, of its own unicity. So how do you go about it? Abhinava has this particular concept called reasoning on the real. The role of the teacher himself is in the investigation of the sacred texts, which prompt the start of it. So it's not the ultimate source of knowledge as it is for Shankara, but rather the initial introduction into the path. And the role of the sacred text is to give rise to proper conceptual thought, disciplines you, because the texts take you beyond plurality to guiding you towards this monism of consciousness. They become the origin of the generation of interconnected thoughts that are coherent and certain. So they become like a textbook properly taught by the teacher on how to progress through the kind of misunderstandings that come so easily to us about a plural world. Such an interconnected series of conceptual thoughts, it says to be reasoning on the real. It's called, I've translated this very complex term called bhavana, is disciplined imaginativeness. Through it, even an indistinct object is made as if present by rendering it distinct. In this context, apart from reasoning on the real, which is the light of purified knowledge, there is no other limb of yoga discipline that is obviously a means. So you can do all your holding your postures and praying and looking at meditative objects, none of it will work. What really works is this process of reasoning on the real, including what he calls disciplined imaginativeness. The disciplined imaginativeness elsewhere, in which he talks about a lot, and of course many different Indian systems talk about bhavana in different ways. Here it seems to be a way of pushing thought to its very limits in a systematic manner. It's like a sort of, the seminar to end all seminars. You really have to keep working until you're exhausted with what it could possibly be to have a state of consciousness that is monistic. Whatever it is, it has to get through thinking, what is it to properly understand that all your ontological categories, while perfectly functional, misguide you into thinking that there are two different things, i.e. a plurality of objects and a plurality of subjects. How do you move out of this apparent givenness in ordinary experience? That's why, in a way, I think Abhinava equivocates about, as many other thinkers do, between whether there is something beguilingly simple and accessible. If you just think about it, you'll see you cannot have this kind of dualism of subject and object and the world made up of material. But at the same time, he also says, well, yes, of course, I recognize actually to get to consciousness, being able to realize that is not at all simple. So monism as a practice is a very arduous undertaking, because it has to get consciousness to the point where it's not simply a question of saying, yeah, I find believable that the only explanation for, the whole of reality is that it is made up of consciousness. It's not just enough. Can one be in that state of consciousness in which there is only that monism. It's a kind of a difficult stumbling block to make that transition from how we conceive of philosophical debates and what a successful debate looks like to how Abhinava thinks a successful debate would look like. The success for him would be for consciousness itself to dissolve the kinds of misunderstandings it has and to be actually in that monistic state. So I'm wondering how to go about this, because I have about the same amount of things to say about Spinoza. But at the same time, I also want to give myself enough time at the end of talking about Spinoza to making the comparisons, what I'm trying to say by juxtaposing them. And the lesson that I'm trying to draw in juxtaposing them is something very different from what I tried to get out of juxtaposing Shankara and Johnson. So although that might be a little bit unfair on those who show up on Monday for the whole talk on Spinoza, I think I'm going to spend a few minutes kicking off on him for and really allowing myself next week on Monday to have enough time to pace out following what I understand of his work in the relationship that I've built up with between him and Abhinava, and give us enough time to do the comparison. So I'll just take a couple of more minutes, just introduce him, and then we'll have enough time to talk about Abhinava, and it's always enough stuff to ask about Abhinava. So I'm going to move on to Spinoza, and in particular, I'm going to be relying mostly on my own reading of ethics. And as you'd have seen, as I'm doing with Abhinava, as I've done with Shankara, it is not an exposition of a thinker, especially when we get thinkers who are systematic and vast in their writings. It's really my picking my way through particular things that have struck me as worth exploring in this juxtaposed relationship between a Sanskrit and a non-Sanskrit thinker. So what that does, perhaps even more, as they say, than with somebody like Chomsky, where the organization of the Chomsky text is open to a complex history of redaction, where how you read them in what sequence is also up for grabs. There is a fluidity and, in fact, almost an invitation to reach out to different parts of them in a way that is intuitive. With Spinoza, it's anything but. Here is, after all, somebody who is going to progress, especially in the ethics, in this very systematic idea of having axioms and definitions and proofs and scholia. And as he's going to say, he's deliberately doing it in a geometric manner. So arguably, somebody could say to me that, you could know more, if you're being true to Spinoza, hop around than you could with, say, Euclid. And I think that there is a rigorous Spinozoan approach that would say, unless you read it in this way, you're not going to be able to reach the conclusions in that particular geometric manner of proof that Spinoza intends. Whether people feel that that's true or not, there is an argument for that. Whereas what I'm doing is very much the same thing as I'm doing with Abhinava, who also has a whole bunch of systematic arguments. And what I am doing, it might seem, is in a way sort of skittering across the things that grip my imagination. And it's true, because my project is neither Abhinava's nor Spinoza's. My project is really to say, if I've read a text and over of an author systematically and in a scholarly manner over a period of time, and I'm nowhere near a scholar of Abhinava in the same way in which people who have spent 30 years reading him, nevertheless, you start picking up certain kinds of intuition. And I read, oddly enough, Spinoza long before I read Abhinava. I read Spinoza as part of my sort of education in Western philosophy when I was completely concentrating on the Indian side on Vedanta and not at all on Abhinava. And it was really a peculiar kind of circularity by which, having engaged with Abhinava, it began to strike me that there were things that I remembered of Spinoza and that were reaffirmed for me in my reading him again in the context of Abhinava, which were important because Spinoza was saying something extraordinarily striking, perhaps in a way, despite his deliberate mobilization of Cartesian categories, completely unprecedented in the history of Western thought. So that's my rather elaborate justification for how on Monday I'm going to clearly and flagrantly be flouting the systematicity with which Spinoza puts forward his argument, but which I hope reconfigures him in a way that brings home to us something about monism as a way of oneness that is interestingly illuminated by juxtaposing him with Abhinava. Stop.
Thank you very much indeed for that most illuminating lecture.